The automatic doors of Seoul General's emergency wing hissed open faster than their hinges were built for, and 3 off-duty officers waiting by the triage desk instinctively reached for their sidearms. They caught themselves half a second later. This wasn't a raid. It was Jinho, the man they called the Ice Dragon. He didn't run. He never ran. But the pace at which he crossed that lobby made the automatic doors behind him bang twice against the wall before settling. 2 men in matching gray trench coats flanked him a step behind, and the waiting room, full a moment ago with the ordinary noise of coughing and crying children, went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when everyone in it recognizes danger and has nowhere to put it. Which floor? It wasn't a question. The attending physician, a woman who had once stitched up a city councilman's son without asking who sent him, opened her mouth to explain hospital protocol and then simply pointed instead. He took the stairs 2 at a time. Nurses on the 3rd floor flattened themselves against the corridor wall without being told to. They'd all heard the stories. The shipping executive who vanished after a missed shipment, the warehouse that burned down in an hour flat over a debt of $11,000. Jinho was a man who ran his empire on the principle that mercy was a currency he'd never once spent. He reached the door of the ICU and stopped dead. Through the glass, he saw her, Sarah, the woman who'd spent 3 years in the corners of his house, refilling his glass before he knew he was thirsty, the only person under his roof who'd ever looked him in the eye. Now her face was a map of bruises, one eye swollen past recognition, a tube taped into her mouth doing the work her lungs couldn't. The monitor beside her traced out a heartbeat in thin green light, the only proof in that sterile silence that she was still fighting. Jinho didn't move for a long moment. Then his hand found the bed rail, and the steel groaned under his grip. The marble in Jinho's mansion had a particular sound when you walked across it in the wrong shoes, a hollow, echoing clap that announced you before you arrived. Sarah had learned in her first week to walk in soft-soled flats that made no sound at all. It was the first lesson the house taught her. To be useful, you first had to learn how to disappear. 3 years had passed since she'd crossed an ocean for this job, since a recruiter in Lagos had promised her good pay and a quiet life cleaning for a wealthy Korean businessman. No one had mentioned the armed men who rotated through the gates in shifts, or the way conversations stopped dead the moment she entered a room, only to resume the second she left it, as if she were furniture that happened to have ears but no memory. She told herself in the beginning that this was simply how the wealthy lived. By the end of the first year, she understood it was something else entirely. This was how the wealthy hid. Jinho's mansion was less a home than a fortress dressed up in chandeliers. Every hallway had a camera. Every phone call from the study was taken behind a closed door with the television turned up in the next room, as if a droning drama could swallow the sound of men discussing debts that ended in bodies instead of money. Sarah cleaned those rooms after the fact. She polished the same mahogany desk where, 6 months into her employment, she'd found a folder left carelessly open, photographs of a man's face, a red circle drawn around it in marker, a date scrawled beneath. She never asked. Asking was how women like her ended up as photographs in someone else's folder. She learned the rhythms of the house the way a sailor learns weather. She learned that Jinho took his tea bitter, no sugar, and that he drank it fastest on the mornings after violence, as though the burn on his tongue was a kind of penance. She learned that his silence was not emptiness but calculation, that behind his flat, unreadable stare was a mind constantly counting men, money, enemies, exits. And she learned, though she never said this aloud to anyone, that in 3 years he had never once raised his voice at her, never once looked through her the way his guests did, the way his own security chief did. Di-sung was the exception to every rule of quiet cruelty the house observed. Where Jinho's menace was cold and contained, Di-sung's was performative, hungry, always looking for an audience to confirm his own importance. He'd risen through the syndicate the way certain men always did, not through loyalty, but through the careful cultivation of other men's blind spots. Sarah had seen him humiliate a driver in front of the entire kitchen staff for arriving 4 minutes late, had watched him confiscate a junior guard's pay for a mistake that wasn't even his. To Di-sung, people were not colleagues or even instruments. They were disposable, interchangeable, useful only until something more useful came along. He looked at Sarah the way he looked at the household staff generally, an inconvenience that happened to still be breathing. You, girl. He never used her name, though he'd heard it 100 times. This tray was late yesterday. Don't let it happen again, or I'll have you replaced with someone who understands what punctuality means in this house. She'd nodded, eyes down, the posture that kept her employed. But she'd watched him walk away with something colder than fear settling into her chest. Sung didn't just abuse the people beneath him because he could. He did it because somewhere in his calculations, cruelty was currency, and he was hoarding it for something. Sung viewed human beings as disposable tools for his ascent. If you despise backstabbers who abuse hardworking people, hit subscribe right now and comment, "I stand for loyalty." It was nearly a year before Sarah understood what that something was. She began to notice the pattern the way she noticed everything, from the edges of rooms, from behind trays and vacuum cords, and the practiced invisibility of her uniform. Sung's late-night calls grew more frequent, always taken in the East Garage, a location conspicuously outside the reach of the mansion's interior cameras. Cameras Sarah knew he had personally installed, and therefore knew exactly how to avoid. His visitors changed too. Men she didn't recognize, arriving in unmarked cars, staying only minutes before vanishing back into the dark. And once, only once, she caught a fragment of a phrase through the garage's cracked door, a phrase that made her stop mid-step with a tray balanced against her hip, her pulse suddenly loud in her own ears. Once the car is confirmed, there's no walking away from this one, not for him. She told herself she'd misheard. She told herself it wasn't her business, that whatever men like Sung and Jinho did to each other was a war she had no part in, a war that had never once asked for her opinion or her safety. She told herself this for 3 days, going about her polishing and her serving and her careful, practiced invisibility, trying to unlearn the 6 words that had lodged themselves in her chest like a splinter. But invisibility, she was about to discover, only protects you until the moment you decide to stop being invisible. And that moment was closer than she knew, waiting for her in the shadows of the East Garage, where a folded schematic and a coil of wire were about to change everything. East Garage smelled of oil and cold concrete, a smell Sarah had come to associate with secrets long before she understood what secrets it kept. She had no real reason to be there that night, only a forgotten stack of folded linens meant for the chauffeur's quarters above the bay, an errand so mundane she nearly sent one of the junior staff instead. She would think about that later, the strange, small decision that put her exactly where she shouldn't have been, at exactly the hour she shouldn't have been there. The garage lights were off except for the amber glow above Jinho's black sedan, the one he took every morning to the tower downtown, the one polished so often it looked less like a car than a mirror. Sarah had crossed halfway toward the stairs when she heard voices, low, clipped, deliberately quiet in the way that told her immediately this was not a conversation meant for anyone's ears. She stopped. Every instinct honed over 3 years of invisibility told her to keep walking, to let the sound wash past her the way it always had. But something in Sung's voice was different tonight. Sharper, colder. Underneath his usual arrogance was something she'd never heard from him before, the particular flatness of a man who had already decided something could not be undone. The wiring goes under the driver's seat, not the console. Console gets swept every week by his own men. Seats never touched. Sung's voice again. Unmistakable, coming from behind the sedan's open hood, where his silhouette bent low over something Sarah couldn't see. A second voice answered, younger, thinner, edged with nerves he was clearly trying to swallow. And if he brings the driver, if someone else starts the car first, then someone else dies first. Not my problem. A pause, the metallic click of something small and precise being set into place. Once the ignition sequence confirms, there's no walking away from this. Not for him, not for whoever's stupid enough to be sitting in that seat. Sarah's blood went cold in a way she would later struggle to describe. Not fear exactly, or not only fear, but a kind of vertigo, the sensation of an entire structure she'd built her understanding of the world on suddenly tilting sideways. She had spent 3 years believing the violence of this house lived somewhere else, in ledgers and phone calls and men who disappeared without explanation. She had never imagined it would arrive folded quietly beneath a driver's seat, waiting for an ordinary Tuesday morning. She should have turned around then. Every rule she'd taught herself, every lesson in silence, in softened footsteps, in the art of being furniture, screamed at her to retreat up the stairs the way she'd come, to forget she'd heard anything, to let this be someone else's war the way she'd promised herself it always would be. But her feet had gone numb, rooted to the concrete, and in that frozen half-second of horror and disbelief, the silver tray balanced against her hip. The one she'd forgotten she was even carrying, the linens still stacked neatly upon it, tilted a fraction of an inch too far. It fell. The sound it made against the concrete floor was obscene in its volume, a clattering, ringing crash that seemed to bounce off every wall of the garage at once, amplified by the cavernous emptiness of the space, until it sounded less like a dropped tray and more like an alarm bell announcing her presence to the entire mansion. For one suspended, airless moment, nothing happened. The garage held its breath. Then Sung's head snapped up from behind the hood of the car, his eyes finding the stairwell, finding her, finding the tray now spinning in a slow, humiliating circle against the concrete. His face, always composed, always performing some version of control, went through a rapid, terrible transformation, arrogance curdling instantly into something far more dangerous: calculation. Who's there? It wasn't a question so much as a demand for confirmation of what he already suspected. Sarah's mind raced through every possible lie, every possible explanation for a maid standing frozen at the top of the garage stairs at 11 at night, and found none of them fast enough. The younger man beside Sung had already straightened, already reaching toward his jacket in a motion Sarah recognized with sickening clarity from the men who guarded the mansion's gates. "It's just I forgot the linens," she managed, her voice thinner than she wanted it to be, betraying every ounce of the terror flooding through her. "For the chauffeur's room. I didn't hear anything, I didn't hear anything." Sung repeated the words slowly, savoring them, already walking toward the base of the stairs with the unhurried confidence of a man who knew exactly how this ended for people who saw things they weren't meant to see. "That's interesting, because you've been standing there long enough to hear quite a lot." Sarah took one step backward, then another, and in the amber half-light of the garage, with Sung's footsteps climbing steadily toward her, and the wired sedan gleaming behind him like a coffin dressed up as a luxury car, she understood with sudden, devastating clarity that she had exactly one choice left to make: run for the mansion's front entrance, and warn a man who had never once looked at her twice, or disappear into the night, and let tomorrow's bomb do exactly what it was built to do. Sarah didn't remember deciding to run. One moment she was frozen at the top of the garage stairs with Sung's footsteps closing the distance between them, and the next she was moving, her flats slapping hard against marble for the first time in 3 years. Every lesson in silence she'd ever taught herself abandoned in an instant. Behind her, she heard Sung's voice sharpen into something like a command, heard the younger man's footsteps join his, but she didn't look back. Looking back would cost her the half-second she needed to survive. The mansion at night was a maze of dim hallways and sleeping wings, but Sarah had spent 3 years memorizing its geometry the way she'd memorized everything else. The fastest route from the kitchen to the east wing, the servant's stairwell that cut 2 full minutes off the walk to the grand foyer. She took it now, taking the steps 2 at a time, her lungs burning, her mind consumed by a single image: the black sedan gleaming under the garage lights, and the thing wired beneath its driver's seat. She burst into the grand foyer just as Jinho was descending the main staircase, dressed for his morning already, though dawn was still an hour away. A rare early departure, a meeting downtown he'd mentioned once, in passing, to no one who was supposed to be listening. He stopped mid-step at the sight of her, his expression flickering through surprise and then something colder, more guarded, the look of a man who understood that nothing in his house happened without reason, and a maid sprinting through his foyer at this hour was not nothing. "Sir, please don't get in the car." The words tumbled out of her too fast, too raw, stripped of every careful formality she'd spent 3 years perfecting. "The sedan! Something's wrong with the sedan." For a long moment, Jinho said nothing at all. His eyes moved over her, the flushed panic in her face, the trembling in her hands, the complete absence of the composed, invisible woman who refilled his tea without being asked. Whatever he saw there, it was enough. He didn't ask her to explain herself twice. Explain, now. I was in the garage. I heard Sung. He was talking about wiring, about the driver's seat, about an ignition sequence. Her voice cracked on the word ignition, the horror of it finally catching up to the fact of having said it out loud, to another human being, in a house where speaking such things aloud could get you killed. I think there's a bomb in your car. The silence that followed was absolute. Then, from the top of the staircase behind Jinho, another voice cut through it, smooth, wounded, indignant in exactly the register of a man caught doing something he desperately wanted to explain away. Sir, with respect, the girl is clearly confused. I was in the garage checking tire pressure for tomorrow's route, nothing more. Sung had arrived at the top of the stairs, breathing hard from the chase but composing himself with practiced speed, his face arranging itself into wounded professionalism. She startled us both, dropped a tray, ran off before we could explain. He turned to Sarah then, and the look he gave her was not fear, not even real anger. It was contempt, pure and total, the look of a man who genuinely could not comprehend that someone beneath him had dared to speak at all, let alone accuse him. You have no idea what you overheard, girl. None. And you've just humiliated yourself in front of your employer over nothing. Sung sneered at Sarah, thinking an ordinary worker had no right to speak up. If you can't stand toxic bosses who think they own the world, hit like to show that everyone deserves a voice. Jinho's gaze moved slowly from Sarah to Sung and back again, weighing something in a calculation neither of them could read. 3 years of watching this man had taught Sarah exactly one truth about him. He did not make decisions based on comfort or convenience. He made them based on risk. And in that silence, she understood he was running the numbers, the cost of humiliating his security chief on a maid's word, against the cost of being wrong. Sweep the car, he said finally, his voice flat, final, allowing no argument. All of it now. Sung's composed mask slipped for just a fraction of a second, so brief Sarah might have imagined it, if she hadn't spent 3 years learning to read every flicker on every face in this house. It was there and gone, replaced instantly by cooperative concern, but Sarah had seen it. Fear. Real, sudden fear. 4 of Jinho's men descended on the garage within minutes, flashlights and gloved hands moving methodically over the sedan's interior while Sung stood at a careful distance, arms crossed, jaw tight. Sarah watched from the foyer doorway, her heart hammering so violently she could feel it in her throat, watching the beam of a flashlight disappear beneath the driver's seat and hold there. Hold too long. One of the men straightened slowly, his face drained of color in the garage's amber light, and turned toward Jinho with words that would end one life in that house and put a target squarely on another's. Sir, you need to see this. The device beneath the driver's seat was small enough to fit in a shoebox, but the man who'd found it wouldn't stop staring at it even after Jinho's demolitions specialist arrived to disarm it, his hands moving with the slow, reverent care of someone handling something that had already decided once to end a life. Wired to the ignition. Professional grade. Enough to take out not just the car, but the better part of the garage bay around it. Jinho stood over it in silence for a long time, his face unreadable in the way Sarah had learned meant he was doing arithmetic no one else could see. When he finally turned around, Sung was gone. No one had seen him leave. One moment he'd been standing at the edge of the garage with his arms crossed and his jaw set in wounded innocence, and the next the space where he'd been standing was simply empty, his car gone from its usual spot near the gate. The guard posted there swearing he'd seen nothing at all, a detail that told Jinho everything he needed to know about how deep this went, and how many hands were already dirty. Find him, Jinho said, and the 4 men who'd swept the sedan scattered into the dark like something uncoiling. He turned to Sarah last. She was still standing near the foyer doorway, arms wrapped around herself, the adrenaline that had carried her down 2 flights of stairs and across a marble hall now draining out of her all at once, leaving something closer to shock in its place. Jinho studied her for a moment with an expression she'd never once seen him wear in 3 years of quiet, practiced invisibility, something that might have been gratitude, if a man like him allowed himself such a soft-edged thing. "You saved my life tonight." It wasn't a question, and he didn't wait for her to respond to it. "Which means you're a liability to whoever wanted me in that car. Sung knows your face. He knows you heard him." He was already moving toward the study as he spoke, already reaching for a phone, his mind clearly several steps ahead of the conversation. "I'm sending you to a property outside the city. Armored car, 2 men with you at all times until this is contained." Sarah nodded, numb, grateful in a way she didn't have words for yet. But an hour later, standing at the mansion's rear entrance while a black armored SUV idled in the drive and 2 unfamiliar men in dark suits waited by its doors, something in her recoiled. She didn't know these men. Didn't know if the rot in this house had already spread further than Jinho realized, further than even tonight's discovery suggested. Sung had vanished without a trace, which meant someone had helped him, someone with access to gates, to guards, to the kind of information that let a man disappear into the night unseen. What if it was one of these 2 men now holding the SUV's doors open for her, waiting to drive her somewhere far quieter than a safe house? The paranoia settled into her chest and would not leave. And so, in a decision she would spend the rest of her life turning over in her mind, Sarah did the one thing that felt, in that fractured moment, like the only safe choice available to her. She waited until the men's attention drifted, murmured something about needing her coat from the staff entrance, and slipped instead through the side gate and into the dark, anonymous sprawl of the city beyond the mansion's walls. She told herself she only needed to disappear for a few hours. Long enough for Jinho's men to find Sung, to understand how far the betrayal reached, to make the world safe enough that she could resurface without wondering who around her was loyal and who was already sold. The subway, at that hour, was still crowded enough with late shift workers and exhausted commuters that she could vanish into it completely. One more tired face among hundreds, invisible in the way she'd always been invisible, the one skill she trusted more than any bodyguard. She descended into the station and let the crowd swallow her, weaving between commuters with her head down, her heartbeat finally beginning to slow for the first time since the garage. The platform smelled of damp concrete and distant food carts, ordinary and grounding, and for a few minutes Sarah allowed herself to believe she'd made the right choice, that she'd traded the mansion's guarded, gilded danger for the far safer anonymity of a million strangers. She didn't see the man in the gray jacket who'd boarded 3 cars down the moment she entered the station, phone pressed to his ear, speaking too quietly for anyone around him to hear. She didn't know that the mansion's compromised gate log had already told someone exactly which direction she'd walked, and that a single photograph of her face, grainy, taken from a security camera she'd forgotten existed, was already circulating among men who did not need much more than that to find a woman alone in a city of 10 million. The train doors closed behind her with a soft, final chime, carrying her deeper into a night that had already decided, quietly and irreversibly, that invisibility would not save her this time. Sarah surfaced from the subway 3 stops later than she'd planned, disoriented by unfamiliar streets and a light rain that had begun to fall sometime while she was underground, turning the pavement slick and orange under the sodium streetlights. She'd meant to find an all-night cafe, somewhere public and well-lit to wait out the hours until it felt safe to call the mansion again. Instead, in her rush to put distance between herself and the station's cameras, she'd taken a turn she didn't recognize, and then another, until the wide commercial street had narrowed into something meaner, shuttered shop fronts, a flickering street lamp, an alley running between 2 buildings that looked like it hadn't seen daylight in years. She heard the car before she saw it, a slow roll of tires against wet asphalt, deliberate in a way that ordinary traffic never was, headlights sweeping the alley mouth, and then cutting out entirely. Every instinct she'd sharpened over the last few hours screamed at her to run, but her body had already gone cold and slow with a fear that felt less like adrenaline now and more like inevitability. The sensation of a trap closing that she'd somehow known, on some level, was always going to close. 2 men stepped out of the dark ahead of her. A third came from behind, cutting off the alley's other exit before she'd even registered there was one. They moved with the unhurried confidence of men who did this often enough to have stopped finding it interesting, closing the distance between them and Sarah with the patient efficiency of professionals rather than the chaos of amateurs. "Where's the list?" The one who spoke was broad-shouldered, unremarkable, his voice utterly without heat, as if he were asking her the time. "Sung said you took something from the garage. Papers. Names. Where is it?" "I don't." Sarah's voice came out thin, swallowed almost instantly by the rain. "I don't know what you're talking about. There's no list. I didn't take anything, I just heard." The first blow landed before she finished the sentence, an open-handed strike across the face that sent her stumbling into the wet brick of the alley wall, the impact ringing through her skull in a white flash that swallowed the rest of her words. She tasted blood immediately, copper and shock, and some distant, rational part of her mind understood with sickening clarity that these men had already decided what answer they were looking for, and no truth she offered was going to satisfy them. "Try again." The second man crouched slightly, bringing his face level with hers, patient in a way that was somehow worse than shouting. "Sung doesn't send us out for nothing. He said you have it. A name list, contacts, something that ties this whole operation together. You give it to us, this ends now." "There is no list." Sarah forced the words out through blood and rain, her hands raised uselessly in front of her, every part of her body screaming to run even as she understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its finality, that there was nowhere in this alley left to run to. "I swear to you, I only heard him talking about the car. That's all I know. I don't have anything." They didn't believe her. Or worse, she would think later, in whatever fractured moments of consciousness remained to her, they didn't care whether they believed her at all. The list was simply a formality, an excuse offered before violence rather than a genuine question awaiting a genuine answer. What followed was not an interrogation so much as a punishment already decided in advance. Delivered methodically, without the mercy of haste. The cowards who beat Sarah did it to protect a corrupt, broken system. If you want to see justice served to bullies who hide in the shadows, subscribe to the channel and comment, "No mercy for cowards." Time lost its shape somewhere in the middle of it. Sarah would never be able to reconstruct, afterward, exactly how long she lay on the wet asphalt, while the rain fell steadily onto a face that no longer felt entirely like her own, the world narrowing to the cold of the ground beneath her and the distant, ringing silence that follows pain past a certain threshold. She heard, as if from very far away, one of the men's voices, clipped, irritated, speaking not to her now but into a phone. "She doesn't have it, or she's better trained than she looks." A pause, listening to whatever answer came back through the line. "No, leave her. If she wakes up, that's a message on its own. If she doesn't..." Another pause, and something in the flatness of his voice made clear that either outcome was equally acceptable to him. "Then that solves a different problem." Footsteps retreated. An engine turned over somewhere beyond the mouth of the alley, tires hissing away into the rain-soaked dark, leaving Sarah alone on the cold ground beneath a sky that offered no shelter at all, and no way, in that gathering darkness closing in around the edges of her vision, of knowing whether anyone in this city even knew she was missing yet, or how much time remained before it was too late for that question to matter. A jogger found her an hour before dawn, curled against the alley wall in a posture that looked, from a distance, like sleep, until he got close enough to see the blood mixing with rainwater beneath her head. The ambulance that carried her to Seoul General moved through empty pre-dawn streets with a kind of urgency that made no difference to the woman inside it, unconscious and unaware that the first call from the paramedics, routine, procedural, meant only to notify next of kin, had instead triggered something that rippled all the way up through a criminal empire built on secrecy. It was the emergency contact listed in her phone that did it. A single name and number Sarah had entered 8 months ago after a minor kitchen accident, never imagining it would be the reason a room full of hospital administrators found themselves. Within the hour, staring at the automatic doors of their own emergency wing as they burst open beneath the force of a man they'd only ever heard about in rumors. This was the moment the story had begun with. Jinho storming the ER, the head of surgery stammering out half a sentence before abandoning it entirely, the corridor emptying itself of nurses who'd heard enough stories to know better than to be standing in his path. But what came after that frozen, terrible moment at the glass of room 402? After the grip on the bed rail, after the silence, was a version of Jinho that none of his own men had ever witnessed. Because grief in him did not stay grief for long. It curdled almost immediately into something far more useful. He didn't leave her bedside for the first hour. He sat in the plastic chair meant for family members, his charcoal suit absurd against the sterile beige of the room, and watched the ventilator rise and fall with mechanical patience, while machines around her traced out numbers he didn't fully understand, but had already decided to memorize anyway. It was during that hour, in the stillness between grief and fury, that one of his men, stationed outside the door on Jinho's silent instruction, noticed something wrong with the room's security camera. The small black dome mounted in the corner of the ceiling, standard hospital equipment meant to monitor patients for the nursing staff, blinked with an access light that shouldn't have been active. Hospital security feeds were closed systems, routed only to the nurses stationed down the hall. This one wasn't behaving like a closed system. It was behaving like something being watched from somewhere else entirely. Jinho's man brought this to him quietly, the way you brought bad news to a man already standing at the edge of an abyss, uncertain whether one more push would send him over it. Jinho listened without moving, without so much as glancing away from Sarah's bruised, unconscious face, and then said two words that set an entire second investigation into motion. Trace it. It took his people less than 20 minutes to answer a question that should have taken hours, because the answer, once they found it, explained its own speed. Whoever had accessed this feed hadn't bothered covering their tracks particularly well, not because they were careless, but because they never imagined anyone would think to look. The remote login pulled from the hospital's network resolved to an IP address that Jinho's technician recognized immediately, because he'd helped install the very system it belonged to. It traced back to Jinho's own corporate tower. Not to some external threat, some rival syndicate probing for weakness from the outside, but to a terminal inside his own headquarters, on a floor with restricted access, logged in during the exact window Sarah had been lying broken in an alleyway 3 miles away. Jinho finally turned from the window into Sarah's room, and something in his face had changed entirely from the raw, unguarded grief of an hour earlier. What remained now was colder, more familiar, the expression his enemies had learned to fear long before tonight. "Who has access to that floor?" he asked, though something in his tone suggested he already suspected the answer and simply needed to hear it confirmed aloud, needed the shape of the betrayal to be spoken into the room before he could act on it. His technician hesitated, scrolling through an access log with the particular reluctance of a man about to name someone powerful. "Security division only, sir. 6 people total have clearance for that terminal." He looked up, and whatever he saw in Jinho's face made him finish the sentence faster than he might have otherwise. Di-sung had access, but he's already flagged as missing. His own credentials would have raised alarms the moment he tried to log in remotely. Then who logged in using his terminal without him? Jinho's voice had dropped to something almost gentle, which was, everyone in the room understood, infinitely more dangerous than shouting. The technician's answer came a moment later, quiet, uncertain, delivered like a man setting down something he suspected might explode. "The login used Di-sung's old credentials, sir, but it was authorized and reactivated 8 hours ago. By Gwan." The name landed in the room like a second bomb, quieter than the first, but somehow more devastating. Gwan. The man Jinho had personally elevated to security chief only 3 days ago, the man who'd stood in his office with his hand over his heart and sworn, in words that had sounded sincere at the time, that he would guard this family the way Di-sung never had. Jinho had trusted him precisely because he was new, unblemished, untouched by whatever rot had been growing in Di-sung's corner of the operation. He understood now, standing in the sterile hum of room 402, exactly how naive that trust had been. He didn't confront it immediately. Rage, in Jinho, had never once been loud, and it wasn't loud now, It simply reorganized itself into strategy, the way it always did. If Guan believed himself undiscovered, that ignorance was a weapon Jinho intended to use before it was taken from him. "Say nothing of this to anyone," he told his technician, his voice level, almost conversational. "Not Guan, not the other guards, no one outside this room. As far as the house knows, we're still chasing shadows." But shadows, it turned out, were already gathering closer than he realized. Within the hour, one of his men flagged movement on the hospital's exterior cameras. A young man, unfamiliar, lingering near the visitor's entrance with the particular stillness of someone waiting for an opportunity rather than a person. He wore a maintenance uniform 2 sizes too clean for someone who actually worked with his hands, and he'd been photographed twice already trying doors that led toward the ICU wing, doors clearly marked for staff only. Jinho studied the image for a long moment. "He's not hospital staff." "No, sir, and he's been circling the building for 40 minutes. It wasn't difficult, after that, to understand what was happening. Whoever had access to that camera feed inside Sarah's room hadn't been watching out of idle curiosity. They'd been watching to confirm whether she was alone, whether she was guarded, whether the job left unfinished in that alleyway could be quietly completed somewhere quieter, somewhere with fewer witnesses and better lighting for a man who preferred to work in the dark. Jinho had no intention of giving him better lighting. He gave the order himself, standing in the hallway outside room 402 with a calm that unsettled even his own men. "Cut the power to this floor. All of it lights, monitors on backup only, cameras dead except mine." A brief pause, his eyes moving once more to the glass separating him from Sarah's still, unconscious form. "If someone wants to finish what they started tonight, let them believe they finally have the chance." The floor went black 11 minutes later, plunged into the kind of total, disorienting darkness that hospitals were never built to survive. Backup generators humming somewhere far below to keep essential machines alive, while every corridor light and monitor screen died in near-perfect unison. Confused staff were quietly redirected by Jinho's men, given a plausible story about electrical maintenance, moved off the floor entirely under the guise of an unrelated safety protocol. Within minutes, the ICU wing that had been full of quiet, ordinary human motion was empty and silent except for the mechanical rhythm of Sarah's ventilator, running on its own protected backup line, and the men Jinho had stationed in absolute stillness along the walls. The young man in the maintenance uniform took less than 15 minutes to make his move, slipping through a stairwell door he clearly believed was unmonitored, moving down the blackened corridor with a penlight cupped low against his palm, and a confidence that evaporated the instant a hand closed around his wrist from the darkness beside him. He didn't even manage to scream before he was slammed face first into the wall, the penlight clattering uselessly to the floor, illuminating nothing but the tile beneath a boot that pinned his ankle in place. Jinho's voice came from somewhere just behind him, low, almost intimate in the darkness. "You're not hospital staff, and you're not here for maintenance." A pause, weighted, deliberate. "Who sent you?" The young man, later identified as Minsu, a low-level enforcer with a record of debts, owed to exactly the kind of people who solved debts with favors instead of money, tried, briefly, to lie. The lie lasted exactly as long as it took Jinho to apply a fraction more pressure to an already dislocated wrist, and then everything came out in a frightened, tumbling rush. The reactivated credentials, the standing order to finish the woman in 402 quietly, and the name of the man who'd given that order less than 6 hours ago, using an authority he had no legitimate reason to have yet. Guan pretended to be an ally while sharpening his knife. If you absolutely hate fake friends and deceptive people, hit like and let us know in the comments how you handle betrayal. Jinho released the young man's wrist and stepped back into the dark, his mind already 3 moves ahead, already calculating exactly how far this betrayal reached and how many more men inside his own tower had quietly decided, in the space of a single week, that his empire was ready to be taken from him, and precisely how much time remained before Guan realized his assassin had failed and made the far more dangerous decision to stop hiding entirely. Jinho left Minsu bound and gagged in a supply closet under armed guard, a loose thread he'd deal with later, and turned his full attention toward a far more urgent question. How long Guan believed he had before his assassin reported back with confirmation that the loose end in room 402 had finally been tied off. The answer, Jinho suspected, was not long. Which meant whatever Guan was planning next, he was planning it now, in the small hours before dawn, while he still believed the board of Jinho's own empire, and the streets that answered to it. His suspicion was confirmed 20 minutes later by a call from his personal assistant, a woman who had served 3 generations of syndicate leadership before Jinho and had learned, over decades, exactly which irregularities to flag at any hour of the night. Her voice, when he answered, carried none of its usual composure. "Sir, there's an emergency session convening at the tower. Full board, all division heads. It was called under your authority 2 hours ago." "I called no session." "I know, sir. The authorization used your executive override code." A pause, heavy with implication. "It's happening now, 20 minutes in the main boardroom. The agenda item is a formal vote of no confidence leadership transition, citing your, quote, compromised judgment following a personal crisis." Jinho closed his eyes for exactly 1 second, long enough to feel the full shape of the betrayal settle into place. Guan hadn't simply been trying to eliminate Sarah as a loose end. He'd been running 2 operations in parallel, one to erase a witness, and another, far more ambitious, to seize an empire out from under a man he'd calculated would be too broken by grief to notice until it was already done. It was, Jinho thought with something almost like grim admiration, not a bad plan. It would have worked on a lesser man. He left the hospital with 4 men and arrived at the tower in under 12 minutes, the black glass structure rising ahead of him against a sky just beginning to gray with the first suggestion of dawn. Security in the lobby, men who owed their positions and their loyalty to Jinho personally rather than to any org chart, stepped aside the moment they saw his face, several of them visibly relieved to see him alive and walking. Whatever rumors had already begun to circulate through the building's lower floors. The executive elevator carried him up in silence, 32 floors of glass and steel passing in a blur, and by the time the doors opened onto the top floor, Jinho's calm had reorganized itself entirely into something colder and far more purposeful. Through the boardroom's floor-to-ceiling glass walls, he could see them already assembled. 11 of his most senior men seated around the long obsidian table, Guan standing at its head where Jinho himself usually stood, mid-sentence, gesturing toward a projected slide that outlined, in clinical corporate language, a transition of executive authority. He looked comfortable there, confident, a man already tasting the shape of a future he believed was secured. Jinho didn't knock. He didn't pause. He drove his shoulder into the boardroom's glass door with enough force to crack the frame, the sound of it swallowing whatever sentence Guan had been in the middle of delivering, 11 heads turning in unison toward the doorway where the man they just voted to remove now stood very much alive, very much furious, and very much done pretending this was a boardroom dispute rather than a war. The silence that followed lasted exactly as long as it took Guan's composure to crack. "This, sir, this is a formality only, a temporary measure given the circumstances, we thought. You thought I'd be too busy grieving to notice you stealing my empire out from under me." Jinho's voice was quiet, which by now every man in that room understood to be the most dangerous register he possessed. He was already moving around the table, unhurried, each step deliberate, while Guan's hand drifted, almost involuntarily, toward the inside of his jacket. "You sent a boy to finish a job in a hospital hallway. Did you think I wouldn't ask him who paid for it?" Whatever Guan had reached for never made it out of his jacket. Jinho closed the distance between them in 2 final strides and drove a fist into his jaw with enough force to send him crashing back into the projector screen, glass and plastic shattering across the table, as 11 division heads scattered from their chairs in a chaos of overturned furniture and shouted alarm. Guan tried to rise, tried to reach again for whatever weapon he'd brought into a room he'd believed would never see this kind of violence. And Jinho answered that attempt by seizing his wrist and bending it backward past the point his own men would later describe, in hushed voices, as clearly audible from across the room. Gwen's scream was still echoing off the glass walls when Jinho's security detail flooded through the shattered door behind him, moving with the practiced efficiency of men who'd been waiting their entire careers for permission to finally act. But as they restrained the broken, gasping shell of the man who'd nearly stolen an empire, one of Jinho's oldest lieutenants leaned close to his ear with a piece of information that made Jinho go suddenly, completely still. A name, connected to accounts Gwen had been quietly moving money through for months, that reached far higher into the organization than either of them had dared imagine. The name Jinho's lieutenant had whispered in the ruins of that boardroom stayed with him through the rest of that long, grinding day, through the calls made to loyal division heads, through the quiet purge of accounts and allegiances that took until well past midnight, through the careful, methodical work of separating what remained of his empire from every hand that had touched Gwen's conspiracy. It was a problem for another day, he told himself, filed away in the same cold, calculating part of his mind that had kept him alive through 2 decades of exactly this kind of war. Tonight, there was only one thing he intended to attend to himself. He returned to Seoul General as the first real light of morning broke over the city, gold and unhurried in a way that felt almost cruel against the memory of everything the night had contained. The floor outside room 402 was quiet again. The emergency generators long since stood down, ordinary hospital light humming back to life in the corridors his men had plunged into darkness only hours before. He found Sarah's room exactly as he'd left it, except that somewhere in the hours he'd spent dismantling a coup, she had opened her eyes. She was still weak, still tethered to more machines than Jinho could name, her face still a map of fatting bruises that would take weeks to heal fully. But her eyes were open, tracking him as he crossed the room, and something in her expression, confusion, then recognition, then a flicker of something that looked almost like disbelief that he'd come at all, undid a knot in his chest that he hadn't fully realized was there. "You're awake." It came out rougher than he intended, stripped of every ounce of the composure he'd spent a lifetime perfecting. Sarah's voice, when it came, was barely more than a rasp around the tube still taped at the corner of her mouth, but he understood the shape of the question in her eyes even before the nurse gently helped remove it. "Di-sung, Gwan," she swallowed, wincing. "Are you?" "Contained," Jinho said simply, though contained was a small word for the wreckage he'd left across 2 locations that night. "You saved my life twice over, once in that garage, and once by refusing to die in an alley when 3 men left you there too." He pulled the chair close to her bedside, closer than propriety or hierarchy had ever once permitted between them, and sat. "I've spent 3 years walking past you like you were part of the furniture in that house. I want you to understand that ends today." Confusion crossed her bruised face, and Jinho reached into his jacket and produced a folder, not the kind that had once terrified her in his study, marked with a stranger's photograph and a date, but something else entirely. Legal documents, bank transfers, the meticulous machinery of a man who solved every problem, including gratitude, with absolute precision. "A trust," he said, setting it on the blanket beside her hand. "In your name, enough that neither you nor anyone in your family will ever again need to clean another person's house to survive. Full medical coverage for as long as you require it. And protection, real protection, not the illusion of it Di-sung's men proved I'd failed to provide." He paused, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, something uncertain moved across his usually unreadable face. "You will not be returning to your old position. I won't have the woman who saved this family serving at tea." Sarah stared at the folder, then at him, tears gathering at the corners of eyes still swollen from the beating that had nearly ended her. "I don't understand. Why me? There were 100 people in that house who would have looked away, who did look away every single day for 3 years. Jinho was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally answered, his voice carried none of the coldness the world had spent decades teaching him to wear like armor. "Because you were the only person in that entire marble house who ever looked at me and saw a man, instead of a title. Di-sung saw an opportunity. Gwan saw a weakness to exploit the moment my guard dropped. You saw someone worth risking your own life to warn." He reached out, an unfamiliar gesture from a man who had spent a lifetime keeping his hands only for violence, and closed his fingers gently around hers. "That's not something I intend to walk past ever again." The traitors thought a maid was the smallest link, but she became the foundation of the entire empire. If you refuse to side with the cruel systems of this world, subscribe and comment "Justice Wins" to secure your seat for the next story. Outside the window, Seoul was waking into an ordinary, golden morning, entirely unaware of how close its underworld had come to reshaping itself in blood overnight. Unaware that the man now sitting quietly at a hospital bedside, holding the hand of a woman the world had once considered invisible, had also learned, in the wreckage of that boardroom, a single name connected to accounts far above Gwan's authority. A name that meant, for all the violence of this long and terrible night, the war protecting the woman beside him was only just beginning.